This is just a short video that runs through markup and margin. Markup and margins relate to profit. So we have cost of product. We hope to make a profit, and the cost plus the profit we're hoping to make gives us the selling price. Okay, so the relationship between cost and selling price is the profit that we're making. Now, how we express that profit, it can be a markup or it can be a margin. If it's a markup, so for example, if we were told that we had a 10% markup, then that is telling us that our profit is 10% of the cost, because markup relates to cost. If we were told that we had a 10% margin, then that tells you that your profit is 10% of your selling price, because margin relates to selling price. So that's the difference between the two. Markup is how much of your cost is the profit. Margin relates to the selling price, the percentage of your selling price, that's profit. Now we can use this for all our calculations. Okay, so cost, profit, selling price. If we use this example here, a product costs £120 to produce, so the cost is £120. An organisation wants to make a 20% markup, so the profit is 20%, but it's a markup, so that's 20% of cost. So 20% of £120, so that means we must be selling it for 144, what it cost plus the profit we want to make. In this second example, margin, so use the same layout, cost, profit, selling price. What do we know? The product has a selling price of £200. The organisation makes a 40% profit, but it's a 40% margin. So that tells us that 40% of our selling price is profit. So 40% of 200 is £80. So therefore, if we work backwards, we know we're selling it for 200. That includes an £80 profit. So take the profit away, and that tells us that the product cost us £120. Okay, so that's using the markup and the margin. Now, based on the fact that your markup relates to cost, if you needed to calculate an actual markup, so here we've used percentages. Where did those percentages come from? For the markup, it's your profit divided by cost times 100. So we can check that 20% figure that we've got. In this example, we had a profit of £24. Cost was 120, times it by 100, and that will give you 20%. To calculate your margin, remember that relates to selling price. So if you're actually required to calculate it at any time, it's your profit divided by your selling price times 100. So the profit in this example, £80, divided by your selling price times 100 gives us 40%. So we know those percentages are right. Okay, so that's shown you how to use your markup, add it to your cost to get your selling price, how to use your margin, so work out your profit from your selling price, takes you back to your cost, and then how we can actually calculate markups and margins. So it really depends what a question asks you to do. It may give you a markup, it may give you a margin, and then you have to use them, or it may ask you to actually calculate a markup as a percentage or calculate the margin as a percentage. So that illustrates how you would deal with either of those requests. However, it doesn't always remain quite that easy, as we'll see with this next example. Right, so a product costs £25 to produce, and you're asked to calculate the selling price required to achieve a markup of 40% and the selling price required to achieve a margin of 40%. So always start with cost, profit, selling price. So we know a product costs £25. We're asked to work out the selling price required to achieve a markup. So that's your profit. So the profit is to be 40%, 40% markup, so that's 40% of the cost. 40% of £25 is £10. So that gives us £35. Okay, so 40% of cost. Now, the second part of this question, the selling price required to achieve a margin of 40%. So cost, profit, selling price. We know the cost, £25. The profit is to be a 40% margin. So that's 40% of your selling price. And now we have a problem because we don't have the selling price. So how can we do 40% of a figure we don't have? So what we do is we look at the percentages first. The profit is 40% of the selling price. In percentage terms, we consider the selling price to be 100%. So selling price is 100%. Our margin is 40%, so that means that in percentage terms, our cost is the equivalent of 60%, the selling price minus the profit. Now that is going to help us to work out our missing figures. So what we know is that the cost of £25, that's equivalent to 60%. So if we take our £25, divide it by 60, that tells us what 1% is. Then multiply it by 100, and that tells us what 100% is. And 100% is £41.67. So that is 100%. So £25 divided by 60 gives us 1%, multiply it by 100 gives us 100%. Now the selling price is equivalent to the 100%. So that tells us our selling price £41.67. So now we can work out the profit, which is the difference between the two, £16.67. Okay, so it's just knowing that maths. You're dividing your cost by your percentage and then grossing it up to 100% to give us the selling price. If we go back to where we looked at the markup, in percentage terms, our cost is equivalent to 100% and our selling price is equivalent to 140, because it's cost plus the profit gives us the selling price. So just to summarise, we've got cost, profit, selling price. With markup, we make the cost equivalent to 100%, we add the profit, and we've got our selling price in percentage terms. With margin, it's the selling price that is equivalent to 100%, profit is 40, so our cost is 60. Okay, so that's going to be quite relevant for some of the calculations that you need to do.